If you could bring it up full size so that you can see it. Thank you very much. Now this slide is used 3 times, large and in full colour, by the UN's Climate Panel in its 2007 Climate Assessment Report, a 1,500-page document of more than usually repellent and diffuse writing style. I often wonder what would have happened if they'd been let loose to write Hamlet's great soliloquy. It would have come out something like this: to be or the contrary. Whether the former or the latter be preferable would seem to admit of some difference of opinion. The answer in the present case being of an affirmative or a negative character, according as to whether one elects on the one hand mentally to endure the disfavour of fortune, albeit in an extreme degree, or on the other, boldly to envisage adverse conditions in the prospect of eventually bringing them to a conclusion. The condition of sleep is similar to, if not indistinct from, that of death. And with the addition of finality, the former might be considered identical with the latter, so that in this connection it could be argued, with regard to sleep, that were the addition to be effected, an end would be put to the endurance of a multiplicity of inconveniences incidental to our fallen humanity, and thus a consummation achieved of a most gratifying nature. But this, if you like, is the pictorial equivalent of that kind of garbage. What they are trying to show in the temperature record of the last 150 years, reconstructed by the very people who hosted the ClimateGate emails, the Hadley Centre and the Climate Research Unit, what they've done is they've put 4 separate trend lines on the data. And you'll notice the more recent trend lines at the right-hand end are steeper than the ones that extend all the way back over 160 years. Now, what are they trying to prove? They're trying to show that the rate of global warming is itself accelerating. Now, this is an entirely bogus statistical technique. Anyone who has studied Statistics 101, on looking at a graph like that, of what is plainly a stochastic data set, one which jiggles up and down in an apparently random fashion, trending gradually upwards. You cannot apply multiple trend lines with arbitrarily chosen starting points and end points, and then draw any conclusions whatsoever as to any acceleration or deceleration in the trend of the overall record, by comparison between those different trend lines. That is an impermissible technique, and I'm going to show you why. Next slide, please. Now, on this second slide, we've still got the full-length record, the long, thin red line there, but the thicker red line, I've chosen my own arbitrary starting and ending points. I've gone back 100 years from 2005, when this graph was drawn, and I've gone to 1905, and I've taken my red graph up to 1945. The green one also starts in 1905, and it runs to 2005. And you will see that the red graph, further back in history, is rising at twice the rate of the longer run. So we've got the rate of global warming slowing down. Now, I've used the same data, I've used the same technique, but I've chosen different starting points and ending points, and I've come up with a completely opposite result from that of the IPCC. And by those means, we can tell who is right here. And we're going to take a vote, because that's how the UN's Climate Panel does science. It does it by consensus. Hands up all those who think that the UN's Climate Panel were right with their graph. Not a single hand, very good. How many think that Monckton's graph represents the truth? Well, sorry, but no. If I have used the same technique on the same data and produced precisely opposite results from the UN's Climate Panel, then what we must deduce from that is that the technique is itself defective. It it is useless for the purpose of drawing any conclusions whatsoever about the trend. So my graph here is just as wrong as that of the IPCC, and I produce it only to show you very clearly why it is that the IPCC technique is wrong. Now they use their graph 3 times, large, in full colour, and they say, they draw conclusions from it, they say the warming is getting more rapid and we are responsible for that. Well, the warming isn't getting more rapid, so we can't be responsible for that. Let's have a look at the next slide so we can see what the truth is. Same data again. Now you'll see 3 pink lines there, which I've added to the graph. What you'll notice is that they are parallel lines. They're drawn, in fact, with a drawing program that draws parallel lines to a very high degree of precision. And what that means is that in the 3 periods covered by those trend lines, which are 1860 to 1880, 1910 to 1940, and 1976 to 2001, the rates of warming were rapid, but they were identical. So there is the truth. There has been no surge in the rate of global warming at all. We have 3 strictly parallel rates of warming. Now we know that the first 2 of those periods of warming cannot have been caused by us adding CO2 to the atmosphere, because during those periods we simply weren't adding enough to make any difference, even on the UN's exaggerated view of how much warming CO2 could cause. So the question is, what caused the 3rd and most recent period? And you will see there's a green line, vertical, towards the right-hand end of the graph. That marks the point in roughly 1983, in the early 80s, when satellite observations, not only of global temperature, but also of various radiation characteristics of the atmosphere, became available for the first time. So that we can find out from 1983 onwards what caused that rapid warming that continued until 2001. Was it anything to do with CO2? In theory, it could have been, if you believe the UN's exaggerated view of how much warming CO2 can cause. But then we still have this niggling question. Why is the warming of that 3rd period no more rapid, no more sustained than in the previous 2 periods? If CO2, which we're now emitting in such large quantities, we're having the huge influence they say it's having. So we're now going to show you what actually caused this 3rd period of warming. Next slide, please. And there it is. This is a record compiled by Dr. Claire Pinker in 2005. And what it shows is that there was a naturally occurring reduction in global cloud cover, particularly over the tropics, particularly low cloud cover, between 1983 and 2001. And the amount of extra sunlight reaching the ground caused a very large amount of warming. Indeed, if we do a simple calculation, which we will now do, next slide please, it caused, up at the top there, very nearly all the warming of the last 50 years, just in that 18-year period. A naturally occurring phenomenon, nothing to do with CO2, nothing to do with humankind. And that is what has caused that period of rapid warming. If we then add, as I've added here, the UN's official formula for calculating the influences of each of the individual greenhouse gases, CO2 at the top and then working down to the others, and we add all of those up, and then we compare the amount of warming that the UN's climate panel would have predicted, taking into account both the global brightening and the greenhouse gas contributions, then the amount of warming that the UN would predict comes out as somewhere between 2 and 4.5 times the actual warming observed over the period. And it gets better, because after that period, at the beginning of the new millennium in 2001, we've now had 9 full years of a global cooling trend since the end of this period of rapid warming.